So you're a beginner with a Canon R series camera, or thinking about getting one. Perhaps you've already played around with it and are disappointed with results, or are okay with what you're getting but are curious whether you have all the quote, best settings. Or maybe you're just wondering what some of the many options actually do, and in what context they could be needed. Today, we'll go over some camera settings and efficiency tips you may have overlooked that could help you improve your photos and videos. Check the chapter bar below if you want to skip to specific sections, which also indicate whether they are relevant for photo, video, or both. Before we dive into the meat of this video, be aware that I will not be discussing lighting, composition, exposure triangle, subject selection, nor will I be going in depth into photo or video editing. These aspects of photography and videography are much more important than your equipment, and none of the settings discussed here will magically make bad shots into masterful ones. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend reading some books or watching some videos on improving your skills in these areas. This video presumes you have at least some idea of what shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and noise, in a camera context, are, and I will not be discussing the auto or scene modes of these cameras much, and recommend that you have some experience with at least program mode before trying out the suggestions here. I also recommend that you have your particular camera's manual on hand, or on browser tab since they're available online. These manuals, being near 1,000 pages, can be daunting, but they are extremely informative, and if your model doesn't initially have what I'm discussing here, you might find it renamed, relocated, or revised as specified in your manual. And finally, I only have access to 2022's Canon R7 and R10, and at least some of the newer bodies have additional options, while the older bodies plus R50, R100, and Powershot V1 may have fewer. The R100 in particular is essentially 2018's EOS M50 internally, and as such is missing several of the more advanced features we'll be looking at. With that said, most of what's discussed here will be applicable to all R series bodies, whether APS-C or full frame. Let's start with photos in the red menu. First choice here is image quality: JPEG, HEIF, RAW, or cRAW, or a combination of RAW and one of the first two. JPEGs are ubiquitous, of course, and compatible with just about everything, but have less dynamic range and more limited ability to be edited compared to HEIF and RAW. Even if you're a casual photographer that doesn't plan on editing your photos much, I do recommend using RAW or cRAW for the sheer versatility they allow. Even though the RAW or CR3 files, as the extension is called, may have limited compatibility when uploaded straight to a computer, the Canon Connect app or the cameras themselves can easily convert your files to JPEG or HEIF if need be, either on a picture-by-picture basis or in bulk with the raw image processing in the blue menu. If you are uploading straight to your computer, Canon offers the free Digital Photo Professional software, which can process RAW files as well, and some smartphones such as this iPhone 12 may also be able to handle them without extra add-ons. If you plan on using high burst photography a lot, however, especially on the more budget bodies with small buffers like the R100 and R50, you may find JPEGs more worthwhile, as they allow longer bursts of photos, although a faster SD card may help with this as well. Bear in mind, the images you see on your camera's screen after you take a RAW photo is actually a JPEG preview, and is what you'll get if you convert to JPEG using the Canon Connect app or convert in camera, or with the Digital Photo Professional software without editing. Also bear in mind, third-party photo editing software may not be able to replicate the exact look of these JPEG previews. So what's the difference between RAW and cRAW? Half the file size, and if you're deeply recovering shadows, the cRAW may be a bit uglier, but myself and many others have been hard-pressed to find any meaningful differences in normal use. But what about shooting in HEIF, or HEIF as it exports as? This is a format that many smartphones use nowadays, and as of filming this video, the Canon Connect app, for iPhone at least, can finally import HEIF files as well, though not compressed like it can with JPEGs. To actually get a HEIF file, RAW needs to be off, JPEG HEIF on, and HDR shooting, HDR PQ, needs to be on. Note that HEIF is not available on the R100. You can also convert RAW files in camera to HEIF. Note that Windows 11, even with the HEIC codec installed, does not appear to be able to view these HEIF files natively. Being a high dynamic range format, you may find the HEIF output to look dark or washed out, especially on standard dynamic range screens. But even on the HDR iPhone 12 screen, I sometimes find it to be so. Newer bodies than the R7 or R10 may process this better, however, and you can also use a custom picture style to autofix it to your liking, as we will discuss later. Note that if you enjoy using the power-saving display performance mode, HDR PQ will disable it. Dual Pixel RAW is a proprietary photo-only feature that requires Digital Photo Professional and can allow you to very slightly shift focus and perspective, and a few other things. In my opinion, the benefits are not worth the hassle unless you have very specific photography needs. Still image aspect ratio is another option for specific needs. If you're doing high volume work, it might be worthwhile to set your needed aspect ratio. Otherwise, it's easy enough to use the full extent of the sensor you paid for and crop in when necessary. Exposure compensation, found in the red menu and as a horizontal scale during shooting, is very important for both photo and video when you're shooting in program mode, shutter priority mode, aperture priority mode, or manual with auto ISO on. In essence, it's a quick way to influence how much light your camera has judged a scene should have, based on the metering mode you have active. More on metering in a bit. Negative numbers cause your image to turn out darker, while positive go lighter. If you are in complete manual mode, including ISO, the exposure compensation bar has no direct influence on your end product, but can still now be used as a suggestion guide. If you're not using the R100, I recommend using exposure compensation either from a dial or the touchscreen, rather than the menus, as those are easier. AEB, in this menu setting, is a legacy way to exposure bracket, which we'll cover in the upcoming HDR section. Metering modes determine how much of your view the camera uses to judge what your exposure should be. Evaluative takes the entire view into consideration and is the auto mode per se, while partial uses a small central circle and spot a smaller circle still. Center weighted average does just as the name implies. Note that video only uses movie center weighted average or none at all. In general, evaluative works well enough, but partial and spot can be useful, say, for scenes such as backlit birds among branches, or a bird in flight against the sky. However, exposure can swing wildly, particularly in these modes, unless you lock the metering, which can be done either through the AE lock button, or, if you're in manual mode, disabling auto ISO. The regular AE lock stays locked for the duration you set in the metering timer section, red menu, while the poorly named AE lock hold actually acts as a toggle, allowing you to take control away from the metering timer, but potentially adding frustrations if you forgot the lock is active. You could also use AE off to end the timer early, but that would come at the cost of another precious customizable button. If you're using one-shot autofocus mode instead of servo, however, you can also set the AE lock to automatically activate in selected modes for as long as you have the focus button pressed. You can specify which metering modes this works with in the AE lock meter mode after focus setting in the orange menu. Unfortunately, this one-shot method only works for photos mode, so video users will have to use an AE lock button instead. The next settings can help with the frequent cause for initial disappointment. The inferiority of your camera's images in high contrast scenes compared to your smartphone. Modern smartphones are doing quite a bit of processing to produce these images, usually by taking multiple pictures at different exposures and making a composite. The small sensor and fast processors of these phones can make this a near instantaneous process, and the end result can look much more attractive than your camera's default 8-bit JPEG preview, at least until you zoom in and see the muddiness that your phone's over-sharpening and denoising causes. You're probably not cropping in much for scenes like this though, so how can our Canons compete? We discussed earlier the benefits of shooting in RAW format and editing, but what if you don't want to do any major editing, or use the HDR PQ mode? Although it's not quite as quick and easy as how phones do it, we can use HDR bracketing to increase the dynamic range of our photos. There are 3 ways to do this, and for all, results are best if you use a tripod or other method to eliminate human shake, though it is still definitely possible to do handheld. If you are using a tripod, make sure to temporarily disable the lens stabilization, as it can introduce motion blur at low shutter speeds. The first and easiest bracketing method is to use one of the HDR options in Creative Filters mode. These use the electronic shutter to quickly take 3 photos in succession, and produce a single composite, just like a smartphone camera. However, how quickly the photos are taken and composite produced may depend on available light, the speed of your SD card, and your camera model. If a red flashing camera symbol appears, it's warning you that a slow shutter speed is being used, and the composite is vulnerable to being ruined by shaky operator hands. If you primarily shoot in one of the more advanced modes, this Creative Filters mode method can serve as a quick way to get an HDR composite without fumbling around in the menus. However, it offers very little in terms of customization, so if you want more input, it's time to head back into your favorite advanced mode and select the HDR mode option in the red menu. It is not HDR PQ, which we discussed earlier, and can be enabled alongside HDR mode. Note that neither of these are available for the R100. There are several options here after enabling. You can manually set how wide you want the dynamic range to be, or let the camera decide, and set whether you want HDR bracketing to last one shot or every one. Set it to 1 if you only need this occasionally, as otherwise it's very easy to forget it's on. Auto Image Align will reduce or eliminate ghosting if you're working handheld, at the cost of trimmed framing. Set this to off for tripod usage. On the R10 and R7 at least, you can also save the source images, so you can try your own composite in editing software instead of relying on the in-camera version, which will be a JPEG or an HEIF if HDR PQ is enabled. Before you take a picture, take note of your ISO if it's in auto, and if you're in P, AV, or FV modes, as the camera will try to raise the shutter speed to reduce ghosting. If you do want to just make your own composite on your computer, or have the R100, you can also use the third method, Auto Exposure Bracketing, or AEB. Select how wide you want the range of exposures to be, and the next 3 photos you take will be automatically exposed in the order set for the bracketing sequence option in the orange menu. You can also find the auto cancellation option for this feature here as well. Highlight tone priority is another way to squeeze some more dynamic range out of your photos and videos. Enabling it disables your ability to reach below ISO 200 or above 32,000, but the transitions between your highlights and shadows will be smoother at the cost of slightly increased noise. If you're not able to make use of the 10-bit video modes, such as HDR PQ or C-Log, highlight tone priority can help you a lot with your standard footage in outdoor situations. Speaking of HDR PQ video, it serves as a very easy way to get more dynamic range out of your footage, which can help a lot in high contrast scenes, but may prove difficult to edit depending on what kind of software or computer hardware you have available to work it with. See my How to Upload and Render Canon's HDR PQ video for more details on what this video mode is and several low or no cost options for processing it. As of this video, The Canon Connect app, for iPhone at least, can be used to upload both HDR PQ and C-Log footage to your iPhone or iPad, but cannot compress it like we can with standard video. Also be warned, such 10-bit video modes may require faster SD cards than what you might be using. See the specifications in the reference section of your manual for your camera model's minimum card requirements. Auto Lighting Optimizer is yet another tool to allow the camera to attempt to correct the lighting of your scenes, and unlike the previous two, this one can be enabled or disabled after you've taken the photo if you're shooting RAW. Again, the brightening it causes can reveal additional noise, but in my experience it's minimal. These settings will be baked into videos though, so I'd advise testing it out yourself before leaving it on all the time. Leaving ISO and Auto ISO can be useful, although it's not something you should necessarily do all the time. You can exercise some additional control over Auto ISO, however, using the ISO speed setting options in the red menus. Note that photos and video are separate. Here, you can set a minimum and maximum range that Auto ISO selects from, and also a min-max for what you can manually select. Note that for C-Log 3 video mode, Auto ISO does respect the minimum of 800, or 400 for the R50 V, and presumably future bodies, even if you have set it to allow lower. For the R100, R50, R50 V, and R10, I would recommend setting Auto Maximum to 6400, especially for video, though each person's tolerance for noise is different. If you primarily use program or AV modes, the min shutter speed option here can also be of great use to you. You can manually set a hard minimum or let the camera decide along an adjustable range. I recommend testing this for yourself in a poorly lit room to determine how slow a shutter speed you're capable of handling. Speaking of noise, the high ISO speed and R setting can make a dramatic difference to your photos and videos at around ISO 6400 and above on APS-C bodies, and is especially important to consider if you are not shooting in RAW. Those looking to use third-party denoising options in post-process should disable this, but those that aren't should test low, standard, and high for themselves to see how much noise or reduction smudging they can tolerate. The examples here were on the R7 in 4K 30 oversampled, which I prefer the low setting on, but different camera model sensors may produce noise differently, which may clean up better or worse. In-camera lens aberration corrections can potentially make a big difference, depending on what lens you're using. Many older lenses, for instance, like this EFS 15-85mm, benefit greatly from distortion and chromatic aberration corrections. Many third-party EF lenses don't offer these in-camera at all, however, and some RF and RFS lenses will prevent you from disabling some corrections, usually distortion, though most third-party editing softwares will allow you to do so. Since lens flaws and distortions can potentially give an image or video character in some situations, some people opt not to use digital corrections, so you might want to experiment for yourself on a lens-by-lens basis. Digital Lens Optimizer, in Canon's words, is like a smart form of sharpening tailored to the specific flaws of a lens model, and is only available for specific lenses. If you want to know more about digital lens corrections, Canon themselves have an excellent video explaining them. White balance is extremely important, and Canon's auto mode does a decent job for many static scenes in my opinion, and you can set it for ambience or white priority. However, it's still worthwhile getting familiar with the other options and perhaps making a quick menu entry or assigning a custom button to more easily change it on the fly. If you're shooting RAW photos, you can easily change white balance after the fact, either in camera or in your photo editing software, but for JPEGs, HEIFs, and video, it is baked in. Don't be intimidated by the color temperature option, as you can see the scrolled results in real time. Setting the custom white balance option, however, is very archaic and requires you to first photograph a pure white object in your scene. Newer cameras such as the R50 V, however, have a much more modern solution. White balance shift is for a specific use case that you'll know if you need, otherwise don't touch it. Picture styles are potentially extremely important as well, depending on whether you intend to do a lot of editing afterwards or use your photos mostly as is. Even if you do intend to edit heavily, a well-selected picture style can reduce your workload by serving as a template. Again, if you're shooting RAW photos, picture styles can be altered or switched after the fact, but JPEGs, HEIFs, and videos are baked in, so it's particularly important to choose appropriately for those situations. The names are mostly self-explanatory for their intended use, but unlike with white balance, I have not personally found auto to be particularly good, and dedicated a button to switching styles on the fly. You can further fine-tune the sharpness, contrast, saturation, and overall color tone for each style if you wish, and either keep the profile like that or save it as one of the 3 user profiles. I highly recommend testing this out if you don't intend to edit your photos or aren't using a C-Log profile for video, which disables picture styles altogether. For example, if you found the HEIF photos too washed out, a bump in the contrast might make things more pleasing. Do note that the named picture styles do differ from each other in more ways than what you can tune them with. So if you find the provided styles insufficient, you can make or import your own using the free Canon Picture Styles editor. It'll save to one of the user-defined profiles, so unfortunately on at least some cameras such as the R7 and R10, it is not usable with HDR PQ. Monochromatic is not just black and white, but can be tinted a small variety of colors. Newer cameras such as the R50 V may also allow real-time color filters that are useful as more than just gimmicks. The clarity slider, red menu, will offer another way to increase perceived sharpness by softening or sharpening high contrast edges. This too can be changed after the fact if you're using RAW, but I generally prefer not to fool with this setting, as even on the R7's 3-inch LCD screen, the changes are difficult to see, and I usually find the result to not be what was expected when uploaded to a larger screen. Unfortunately, it's not available in HDR PQ mode. The shutter mode is another potentially important selection for photos only, depending on what subjects you shoot and what your camera has available. Most have 3, mechanical, electronic first curtain, and electronic, although most of the more budget bodies, such as the R50 and R8, only offer the latter 2. Mechanical shutter is the traditional method used by DSLRs, and aside from the highest end cameras, typically offers the most dynamic range and least amount of high velocity warping, also known as rolling shutter effect. This may seem like the best option to use, but the slamming of the shutter may be noisy and can also shake the camera and introduce blur to low shutter speed photos, known as shutter shock. The degree to which this happens depends on your camera model and lens for the shake. This R7, for instance, is infamous for how loud it is and how much shutter shock can occur through some lenses. Mechanical shutter is also typically slower in burst modes, which is usually only an issue for high-speed genres such as sports and wildlife. For most Canon cameras, aside from the highest end ones, mechanical shutter is also the only mode that allows 14-bit RAW, whereas the other 2 are limited to 12-bit. In theory, this means your photos contain more color data and may allow for better shadow or highlight recovery, but in practice, myself and many others are unable to see a difference outside of extreme shadow recovery. Electronic shutter avoids the use of shutter mechanisms altogether, and as such is the quietest, fastest, and potentially most crisp mode you can use. If that silence is a bit too much for you, however, and you want some level of audible feedback, beep and volume in the yellow menu will allow you to adjust it to your liking. Electronic shutter can cause rolling shutter with fast-moving subjects and camera movements, most likely to be visible with sports or wildlife genres. The degree to which this effect occurs depends on your camera model, with older and lower-end bodies tending to suffer worse. This mode is also very susceptible to artificial light flickers, and unlike the other two modes, the anti-flicker shooting feature cannot be used. You'll either have to switch to one of those or try to slow or match your shutter speed to the frequency of the offending light source. And speaking of lighting, if you use a built-in or synced flash, these are disabled in electronic shutter for most Canon cameras aside from the highest end. Electronic First Curtain, or EFCS, is an attempt to take the best of both worlds, offering lower rolling shutter and less shutter shock and volume than full mechanical. And in general, I recommend using this mode unless you have one of the fast readout high-end cameras, have a specific need for one of the other two shutter modes, or plan to shoot high shutter speeds with a wide aperture. In such situations, the blurred backgrounds and light spears in this particular mode can get messed up. You can still suffer vibration from the shutter mechanism though. Your top burst speed is slower than electronic, and depending on what camera model you have, you might still find it loud. If you do prefer to shoot in mechanical or EFCS, you might find it worthwhile to set up a button or at least a quick menu slot for the silent shutter function, which will allow you to very rapidly switch to and from electronic shutter mode without beeps, which will be very handy if you suddenly need silence or fast burst regardless of rolling shutter. Drive mode is another photo-only feature, and is split into timer modes, low-speed continuous shooting, and high-speed continuous shooting. The exact speeds of the latter two depend on your camera model, but note that high-speed continuous will take at least 2 photos when you fully press the shutter button, so if that bothers you, and you don't need the high-volume bursts, I recommend sticking to low-speed continuous, which simply acts as single shooting until you keep holding the shutter button down. Note that if you're using touch shutter for the LCD screen, it acts as single shooting regardless of whether low or high is selected. Self-timer 10 and 2 second remote offers you a way to delay photos after you press the shutter button, use touch shutter, or the Canon Connect remote shooting. Using the time to include yourself in a group photo is the obvious use for this, but it's also handy for low shutter speed photography, as the physical act of depressing the shutter button introduces shake, which the delay will eliminate. You can turn off that annoying beeping in the volume menu, but unfortunately it does not appear you can turn off the flashing lamp on the front of the camera, which warns you of the impending photo. At least not so for the R7 or R10. Folks online recommend taping over the lamp if you need its light hidden. Neither can you customize the countdown time for these modes, not even for the self-timer continuous shooting, which is set to 10 seconds. Video mode also has a self-timer available, however, since you can always trim the excess footage in camera or in post, I personally don't recommend using it, especially if you think you might be filming action. The third self-timer behaves differently, as it takes a sequence of photos, the number of which you set after the 10 seconds are up. If you want more customization over how your camera automatically takes photos, Interval Timer will allow you to do so, and can be combined with the self-timer drive modes as well. Note that the camera will automatically autofocus in this mode unless set to manual, and it can skip shots under certain conditions, leaving you with less than the number of shots you set. The camera can also still turn off while doing this if you have auto shutoff enabled. If you want your interval shots to be automatically made into video, Time-lapse has you covered, with a ton of different options, the most notable in my opinion being the auto exposure setting, unless you've manually set everything. Use first fixed frame if you're filming a sunset, for instance, to capture that beautiful conversion to dusk. There are so many quirks and caveats to time-lapse, some of which may be specific to different camera models, so I recommend you consult your relevant manual here for more specifics. For instance, on the R7 here, your minimum interval is 2 seconds, and you cannot have C-Log 3 activated for some reason, though you can have HDR PQ on. Image stabilization can help you with both handheld photo and video, but is highly dependent on your lens and whether your camera has internal stabilization, also known as IBIS, or IBIS as I'll call it here. Currently, only the R1 through R7 feature this. Those without IBIS will not be missing out on much if they are using stabilized lenses, and in fact may even be a boon in video, since Canon IBIS is known to cause corner wobble for wide-angle videos, and cannot be turned off independently from lens stabilization. If you're using third-party EF lenses, you'll also likely run into glitchy IBIS behavior, unless your chosen lens is lucky enough to have a relatively recent firmware update that fixes it, as is the case with this EF mount Sigma 18 to 35mm art. If your camera body lacks IBIS and your lens lacks stabilization, however, there are a few things you can do. For photos, raising the shutter speed to compensate is the easiest, although this will also require a corresponding rise in ISO or widening of aperture if possible. For video, digital stabilization is available and works by cropping in a various amount. I personally find enhanced too aggressive for relatively little gain over standard. For photos, if you use a mix of stabilized and non-stabilized lenses and shoot on P or AV modes, you may wish to calibrate your ISO speed settings for auto range or minimum shutter speed for your longest focal range non-stabilized lens. Of course, if you're using a tripod, in general don't forget to turn off lens or body stabilization, as it can introduce shake at lower shutter speeds. Though for video at longer focal ranges, it can help soften movements from cheaper tripod heads. Some modern lenses also automatically turn off, however, if they sense they are not handheld. Focus bracketing is a potentially extremely useful feature if you need a wider depth of field than your settings would otherwise allow, macro being the most obvious beneficiary. It works by rapidly taking a series of photos with the focus point increasingly shifting away from you, the amount of photos and focal increments of which are specified by you. Some cameras also have the option of creating a JPEG composite, or HEIF if you have HDR PQ enabled, with cropping to fit as an additional option if your lens suffers from focus breathing or you're doing handheld. Speaking of handheld, it is possible to use this feature even though it's meant to be used on a tripod in a controlled environment, but be aware of the increased chance of ghosting in the in-camera composite. Of course, you can also use the supporting series of photos with your own focus bracketing software of choice after the fact. Personally, I find around 10 photos with a focus increment of 4 and a high shutter speed to be more than enough in most situations, as the more you take, the more you'll be susceptible to subject movement, but try different options to see what fits your needs the most. Remember to focus on the closest segment of your subject that you want in focus, and try to select an aperture between f5.6 and f11, as Canon advises. Also try to get into the habit of disabling the mode as soon as you're done with it, as unless you have it assigned to a non-updating custom dial, more on that later, it's all too easy to forget it's on. Although Canon's supplemental information page lists a limited amount of lens compatible with focus bracketing, I have found several other older Canon and third-party EF lenses to also be fully functional with this feature as well, though those with slow autofocus are probably not as easy to use with this. Be aware that most cameras do not support flash with this mode, the exceptions being those with fast sensors such as the R1, R3, and R5 Mark II. All R series cameras except the R100 have a touchscreen, and offer a way to both focus and take photos by tapping said screen. The latter can be enabled or disabled from either the menus or the screen itself via an icon. Be aware it will take a photo only when focused, unless you're in manual focus mode, and will take a photo every time you focus, so you may want to keep touch shutter disabled until you know you'll need it. Focusing via the touchscreen acts like one-shot mode, even if servo autofocus is activated. If you have a camera body that disallows assigning customized autofocus settings to a button, as this R10 does, the touchscreen can help if servo is failing you or otherwise unnecessary, and in general is a quick way to aim your focal points. Be aware that touch focusing still behaves as normal when it comes to subject tracking overriding the autofocus area, so it's not a complete workaround. Also be warned that, at least on the R7 and R10, neither touch focus nor touch shutter work while you're magnified. Display simulation drastically changes the way you see your photos. Disabling it altogether gives you something similar to what your naked eye might see, as further does the OVF sim and view assist, though since these cameras have lower dynamic range than human eyes, it's not quite the same. You will have to rely on your knowledge of the exposure triangle to produce properly exposed photos in these modes. If you'd rather see what you'd be getting in real time, put it on exposure, with or without DOF. DOF, or depth of field simulation, will allow you to see in real time what it looks like if you have stopped your aperture down from its widest opening setting, which is where it typically autofocuses from. All RF lenses, but only certain EF lenses, are compatible with this feature. Consult Canon's supplemental list if you're curious. The Suppress Low Frame Rate setting, located under Display Performance setting, might seem like a great idea at first. Saying goodbye to the choppiness makes composing and autofocusing so much faster and easier after all. However, autofocus actually will struggle more in low light scenarios, and Canon lists a bevy of other cons as well, so think hard before checking that box. You might think that keeping it on power saving mode is the way to go, especially for bodies with the smaller LP E17 battery, which can be drained before a day at the zoo or aquarium is over if you shoot video. You might want to save battery power in other ways, such as screen brightness, screen dimmer, and auto power off. If you do choose to use a lower screen brightness, I recommend assigning a button to the Maximize Screen Brightness function, or at least add a quick menu entry for it, as it can help with viewability outdoors in sunlight. The Shooting Info display is another important setting to carefully customize, as there are some extremely useful options here that are disabled by default. Screen Info and VF Info settings both affect the amount of information displayed on your back screen and viewfinder. You can edit what appears here by pressing Info and limit how many different variations you cycle through as well. A grid can help you with composition, and Lens Info display is an absolute gem, allowing both focal length and focal distance to be viewed in real time on your screen or viewfinder. The latter can be particularly useful if you have lenses with variable minimum focus distances, such as the RFS 18 to 45mm kit lens of the R100, R50, and R10. The gray bar on the left indicates the distance limits for autofocus, while the white line beneath indicates the overall focus limits. If the white line reaches under the gray bar, it means you have additional close focusing capability with manual focus. Do note this feature is only available for certain lenses, however. I highly recommend enabling the histogram and electronic level. The former can be invaluable in helping you avoid blown highlights or crushed blacks in real time, alongside enabling the highlight alert in the blue menu to inspect the photos or videos that you've already taken. Brightness histograms are easier to interpret. If the white area is pushing up against either end of the histogram area, or against the gray zones if you're in HDR PQ or C-Log, it means your image is clipping. The histogram can be used in video as well, but unfortunately it's disabled in most Canon cameras as soon as you actually start recording. Aside from the R100 and probably the R and RP, however, zebras are available. But what are they exactly in this context? There are plenty of other videos that can explain how to use them properly better than this one, but to put it simply, there are black and white diagonal hashing that appears over areas of specific brightness in your footage, Zebra 1, left slanting stripes, or areas that exceed the set brightness, Zebra 2, right slanting stripes. Zebra 2 is by default a glorified highlight alert that can help keep you from blowing them out, while Zebra 1 is often used to denote properly exposed skin tones. You can have both on at the same time, but personally I find such a view too busy and hard to tell apart, and just use Zebra 2 alone, but you may have an easier time using them together. Note that at least on the R7, a Zebra 2 setting higher than 65% does not appear to function in HDR PQ mode, nor does a setting higher than 95% for C-Log 3. Be warned, zebras do not auto-update to match each mode's brightness cutoff. A few camera models, such as the R5 Mark II and R50 V, will also have access to false color and/or waveforms, which provide alternate ways to monitor your video exposures. In addition to the aforementioned electronic level, as of this video, the R7, R5 Mark II, and R1 have an auto level feature, which physically rotates the sensor to a limited degree to horizontally stabilize. It can be a great time-saving feature both for tripods and handheld use, and works with both photo and video. However, beware when filming while handheld or panning, as having the auto level active during these maneuvers will likely cause distracting rocking. If your camera model has custom shooting mode dials, C1, C2, etc., definitely do not overlook these, though be aware the R10's dials, and perhaps also some on the older bodies, are limited to photos only, and the R50 Vs are limited to video. You can assign your favorite shooting modes to these dials, and in addition to the benefits of proximity, setting Auto Update Set to disable will freeze your registered settings. You can change them as needed in real time, but when you turn the camera off and on again, or switch to a different mode and back, all the original settings will be back to the state you originally set them to, aside from a few like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, language, card recording, and several other yellow menu items. To get an idea of just how useful this is, here's a scenario. You're taking pictures of a pet in action, and as such, you have C1 set up to shutter priority mode, defaulted to 1/500th shutter speed, and auto ISO, but ready to adjust on the fly as needed. While animal eye tracking servo mode is on, high burst drive is active, and a wide autofocus area is set. You suddenly notice a beautiful flower, and quickly switch to C2, which you've set for aperture priority mode, defaulted to f5.6 and ISO 100, with no subject tracking, single shot mode on, and autofocus area set to spot. You've just saved yourself from a minute or more of digging around in the menus or fiddling with settings, and when you're done with the flower, you can switch back to pet mode with but a single flick of the dial. I've mentioned quick menus several times before, and in the red menus you have the option to customize both the components and arrangements, which I highly recommend you do, especially if your camera body is lacking in customizable buttons. The manual will list what your particular model can add here. If you have C dial set to not auto update, you can tailor each quick menu to each customized shooting mode, though note that the default selected quick menu item will always be the one you selected last, unless it is not present in a different mode, in which case it will default to the first entry. Note that the R50 V seems to use a different quick menu system, which might not work as I just described. Some options are not available to put in the quick menu, such as C-Log 3 and high frame rate mode on the R7. If you want easy access to such options, or your quick menu and customized buttons are full, the next best thing is the green favorites, My Menu, which allows you to place any menu item in a list in the arrangement of your choosing, multiple pages being possible. Under Menu Display, you can choose to have the menu default to opening the favorites page, or even show only the favorites page, both of which will reduce the amount of time you have to spend hunting down particular menu items. Note that it will default to the page you were last on, even if you turn the camera off. I highly recommend taking the time to set up a favorite menus for yourself. Using manual focus might seem a simple matter of just switching autofocus off, but some lenses, such as the two RFS kit lenses, lack a switch altogether. To solve this, you'll have to select focus mode in the pink autofocus menus, or, if you have an R7 or R10, switch the AF/MF lever on the front of your camera's body. Note this lever does nothing if your lens does have an autofocus switch, and you can disable its functionality altogether in the yellow menus. Many modern lenses use a fly-by-wire electronic manual focus system, which means you cannot focus while the camera is off or in autofocus mode, unlike many analog focus lenses, which often have a physical focus scale. However, electronic full-time manual focus brings this functionality back on many RF lenses and 2 EF lenses, though you won't have any of the focus guide features. More on those later. While electronic full-time MF allows you to manually focus at any time, you can instead use lens electronic MF to limit it to use while half pressing the shutter button in one-shot autofocus mode. This should work with any lens with an electronic manual focusing system, and you'll get the focus guides if that one-shot enabled setting. Note that if electronic full-time MF is enabled, it overrides the 2 disabled options in this menu. MF peaking and focus guide are incredibly useful features I highly recommend keeping enabled. Peaking shades areas in focus with a specified color, while the guide gives you a movable box that turns green when you're in focus. Unfortunately, these disappear when you magnify or are using digital zoom video, and peaking is further unavailable to use with zebras, with both modes requiring the extra step of manually shutting the other off first, before they can then be enabled. And finally, RF lenses have a customizable control ring, more on that later, which doubles as the manual focus ring on many of the smaller and budget-oriented lenses, again, as in the case of these 2 RFS kit lenses, and even on some third-party RF lenses. Unfortunately for these double-duty lenses, you must manually switch between the functions if you like to use both, but at least you can dedicate a button or a quick menu slot towards it. Autofocus capabilities and options vary widely between bodies, and I recommend consulting videos or reading material for your specific camera to fully understand how it handles things. That said, there are still more general settings we can discuss here, such as the differences between one-shot and servo. One-shot is your classic camera autofocus mode. Half press the shutter, or an AF on button if your camera body has one, and if the camera finds something to focus on within the autofocus area you've selected, it'll turn green and lock that focal point until you either take the picture or let go. Unless you set one-shot AF release prior to release, you won't be able to actually take a picture until the camera thinks it has focus. In dark conditions, you can help the camera find focus by enabling the AF assist beam firing, either using the amber on-camera LED or an external one, but be warned the on-camera one can be blocked by longer lenses. If you use the magnify button frequently, you can also one-shot focus in this mode, and the camera seems to have a much easier time finding something to lock onto in this view. Servo autofocus doesn't truly lock per se, but is constantly refocusing as long as you have it active. In stills mode, it turns blue, rather than the green of one shot, when you are holding the autofocus button and the camera believes it is latched onto something. Servo is the default autofocus behavior for video and runs automatically. Holding the autofocus button in video acts like one shot, but will immediately go back to servo the instant you release it. Pressing Pause Movie Servo AF on your screen or dedicating a button to it will allow you to temporarily disable as needed, as will switching to manual focus, of course. On some bodies, such as this R7, Stills Mode Servo receives a whole page of case behaviors to use with tracking, while newer bodies, such as the R5 Mark II, have simplified things. In video mode, you can also adjust the speed at which your autofocus switches to a new focal point on its own, though the speed will be confined to your lens's limitations. If subject tracking is off, Servo will respect the confines of your chosen autofocus area. Most cameras from the R6 Mark II onwards also feature AI focus, which is apparently an auto mode of sorts, where the camera switches between the two as needed. As I lack a camera capable of this, I cannot comment on its effectiveness. If you want to quickly shift between servo and one-shot manually, however, you can dedicate a button or quick menu option towards it, or use the touchscreen focus capability as one-shot if you don't have the R100. If your camera has a touchscreen and an electronic viewfinder, or EVF, you can also move your focus point around by dragging it across the screen while using the EVF. This is particularly useful for bodies that lack a joystick, such as the R50 and R8, and you can adjust which section of the screen is sensitive for touch and drag, as well as the positioning method. Relative works like a joystick, allowing you to drag the point around from wherever you first touch, while Absolute allows for tapping in addition to dragging, and treats whatever you have the active touch area set to as the entire screen. Note that your nose can inadvertently activate touch and drag, especially if you're a left-eye shooter such as myself, but careful selection of the active touch area can reduce its chances of this happening. Unfortunately, the selected active touch area does not automatically rotate or change if you orient your camera vertically. Subject tracking is a powerful feature primarily meant to be used with servo autofocus, though it does work with single-shot mode as well. Note that it may work differently in newer or older generations of R series cameras than the R7 and R10 belong to, so consult your manual and/or specific video guides if your own autofocus does not behave as I describe here. For instance, the older Digic 8 cameras, EOS R, RP, and R100, use a more primitive form of autofocus for 4K video. Back to the subject tracking though, if you activate it without a subject selected, one-shot mode and movie servo will act as normal, but still servo mode will initially try to find something to focus on within your selected autofocus area, then opens up the entirety of the lens's tracking frame in an attempt to keep the subject in focus as it or you move. If you have a whole area autofocus enabled, tapping the touchscreen, if your camera has one of course, will activate a double-bordered white box for both movie and stills mode, which your camera will try to keep locked onto the chosen subject as it or you move. Note that subject tracking does not need to be activated for you to use this method, and you can also use it without the screen and with other autofocus areas if you'd assign Start-Stop Tracking to a button. If you do select a subject to detect, first consult your manual to see exactly what is included in each mode, as it can differ between camera bodies. For the R7 and 10, for instance, animal includes dogs, cats, birds, and secondarily humans, while the Powershot V1 omits birds. Turning eye detection on further reduces the focal zone if the camera finds what it considers to be an eye. You may wish to turn this off in scenes with challenging lighting or creatures at great distances, or bearing spotted patterns though, as it can decrease your chances of getting an accurate lock in such situations. Either a quick menu or customized button will allow you to toggle it off. Note that eye detection does nothing if Subject to Detect is set to none. Once you've selected a subject, you will notice boxes of various sizes appearing around the relevant being or vehicle, often outside your autofocus zones if you have a smaller one active. If said boxes are white instead of gray, then that is what will be focused on when you activate autofocus, regardless of whether it's outside the boundaries of your autofocus area or not. Using a Start-Stop Tracking button we discussed previously will lock it to the active box if you have multiple choices. Note that newer cameras such as the R50 and R6 II, however, have a whole area tracking Servo AF option, which, when turned off, does force the tracking to respect the boundaries. While allowing tracking to have full run of your entire screen is useful in many circumstances, it can be disruptive when you suddenly want to focus on a particular spot and the camera keeps fighting you. So how can we overcome this without having to waste time in the menus? Some newer cameras will let you assign a button to cycle through the selection of subjects you've limited instead. If your camera has custom dials, dedicating one for tracking and one for not can get you back into control at the flick of a switch, though if you're using variable manual settings, this may not be ideal. Using touchscreen focus overrides any tracking you have active, though if you're using your shutter button to autofocus, you'd also have to combine this method with an enabled touch shutter. Decoupling your shutter button from autofocus and using one or more back buttons for autofocus is another option, especially when combined with manual focus for finer adjustments. Higher-end camera models, such as this R7, have an option to assign buttons to Switch to Registered AF function, which switches to user-defined autofocus and subject detection parameters when pressed, or a more advanced and comprehensive version, Register Recall shooting function. Such cameras can also customize metering and AF start independently for each button you assign it to. For example, you could set the AF on button for servo animal eye tracking and the AE lock button for one-shot no subject tracking. Unfortunately, this is not available for the R10, and I was unable to find out whether it was also excluded from the R50, R50 V, and Powershot V1. Feel free to leave a comment down below if you do know. But what can we do for those bodies like this R10 who are arbitrarily limited in this manner? We can set up a partial workaround for humans and animals by setting the autofocus to servo, subject tracking and eye detection off, and subject to detect to one of these two. Then set another button to eye detection AF, which will activate both subject and eye tracking when pressed. Then, whenever you don't need to track a subject, you simply press your normal autofocus button to focus on the confines of your chosen autofocus area. You can also substitute or supplement eye detection AF with start-stop tracking, as discussed earlier. Credit to YouTuber Let's Go Birding for this tip. I highly recommend his camera-specific guides if you do wildlife or pets. For both photo and video, if you find your camera wildly hunting when attempting to autofocus, as it often does in dark scenes, setting lens drive when AF impossible to stop focus search may be of great help to you. Depending on how sticky your camera model's tracking is, or how you have it set to switch tracking subjects, you may find stop focus search useful even in normal scenes to prevent unwanted wandering. However, I would not recommend activating this if you are using a shallow depth of field or super telephoto lens, unless you have ready access to the manual focus ring, since if the camera can't recognize the subject to focus on in this mode, it won't even try. Unfortunately, you cannot assign lens drive when AF impossible to a button or the quick menu, at least on the R7 and 10, so you're limited to a favorites menu entry if you want to switch it relatively quickly. Preview AF, or continuous AF in older bodies such as the original R5, continually run autofocus in stills mode when activated, mimicking the behavior of video servo mode. I recommend you don't activate this mode outside of very specific scenarios, such as handheld selfies or perhaps if stop autofocus search is on, since the constant hunting is both battery draining and can cost you opportunistic shots. Most R-series cameras have a multifunction lock, either a dedicated button or as part of the on-off switch. If you like to keep a camera on while walking around with it, this lock can prevent accidental changes to settings as it jostles about. You can choose which group of controls lock, so if that pesky touchscreen keeps moving your autofocus points around, for instance, you can just lock that. Exposure level and ISO speed setting increments in the orange menu allow for finer tuning of each, although auto ISO will always adjust in 1/3 increments regardless of what you have set. Beware if you use C-Log 3 for video, as ISO selections between full stops are actually noisier, as seen here, and auto ISO will still consider these increments fair game. A related feature for video users will also be available in the red menu, AV 1/8 stop increment, which, as the name implies, allows much finer manual tuning of aperture values if you're using an RF or RFS lens. It works for aperture priority or full manual mode, and you can always use the touchscreen if you find your dials aren't fast enough. The auto slow shutter video setting, also in the red menu, isn't actually anything special. It only works in auto or aperture priority modes with a 60 or 50 frames per second video mode, and records brighter movies
by allowing the frame rate to drop as low as 1/30th or 1/25th if you're in PAL. This can make for weird or choppy looking footage, especially if you're using the footage as slow motion, so I don't recommend using this setting. Safety Shift, orange menu, provides two interesting photo-only features for shutter priority and aperture priority modes that somewhat defeats the purpose of them. If the shutter speed aperture setting mode is selected, right before taking a picture, the camera will automatically change your shutter speed or aperture, depending on which priority mode you're in, to match what the camera believes to be a balanced exposure, regardless of what you had it set to before. Unlike program mode though, as long as balanced exposure is attainable, either through auto ISO or auto shutter or aperture, it will stay on your initial selection. At least on the R7 and R10, Safety Shift does not seem to respect the minimum shutter and aperture range if you have one. And since you cannot add it to a button or a quick menu to rapidly enable or disable, I would advise only activating it for specific use cases or a dedicated custom dial. For example, a beginner birder or one with slow reaction times could set a custom dial for shutter priority mode defaulting to 1/2000th shutter speed for freezing action. With Safety Shift on, if a bird in the shade is encountered and needs a quickly snapped opportunistic photo, the camera would automatically lower the shutter speed to a more usable exposure, though if it needs to slow too much, you'd be at the risk of motion blur ruining the shot instead. On a similar note, if auto ISO is enabled in such a scenario, Safety Shift would only lower the shutter speed to match the maximum allowable ISO set in auto range. The second Safety Shift option, ISO speed, behaves much like auto ISO with one exception. If you manually select a specific ISO, either temporarily through the dial or more persistently with the ISO button or touchscreen, Safety Shift will override your selection if it needs to do so to get a good exposure. This option works in program mode as well as TV and AV, and obeys the limits you set for ISO speed auto range. I could see this mode being useful if you want to keep your ISO manually low, but are amenable to a high one in a pinch. Otherwise, using auto ISO with a dial just seems a better option in my opinion. If you use variable aperture lenses, such as those found in most budget zooms such as the kit lenses, you may find same exposure for new aperture to be useful for full manual mode photos. Normally in such situations, your exposure will darken as you zoom out, but if you enable the ISO or TV options here, your ISO or shutter speed respectively will automatically lower to compensate, or raise if you're zooming back in. The ISO TV option is a combination mode that works like ISO at first until it hits a maximum or minimum, respecting your custom set limits, upon which shutter speed will alter for the remainder. Speaking of custom limits, note that set shutter speed range and set aperture range appear to work only for stills mode, and does so for both manual and auto selections. Unlike the min shutter speed under ISO speed settings, it does provide a hard limit, but as mentioned earlier, Safety Shift TV AV will ignore them if it needs to, so experiment with both of these modes to see which might suit you best. Retract Lens on Power Off is a protective option meant for certain lenses with a fragile external focusing elements, such as the RF50mm f1.8 and this RF24mm f1.8. Enabling it will result in said focusing element returning inside the lens when the camera powers off, either manually or automatically. Note that you will lose your current focus plane when this happens, and I have seen forum posts and videos on how this can affect all lenses, not just the externally focusing ones. However, I have not been able to replicate this with an R7 and RF 100-500 or RFS 18-45, so this bug has either been fixed or only plagues older camera bodies. I've mentioned customized buttons a lot in this video, and you can find the options to do so in the orange menu, or lime green one in the newer bodies. Consult your specific model's manual for what functions you can assign to which buttons, as there are arbitrary limits, especially in the more budget cameras. Note that LFN refers to a customizable button on certain high-end lenses. If your camera has custom dials, you can independently assign custom button functions for each dial, which may be tougher on the muscle memory, but can be very helpful if you have dials split by genre. Custom dials are mostly self-explanatory, but the control ring is more involved. All RF and RF lenses have a control ring, as does the Powershot V1, which are not located in a consistent location, may be clicky or non-clicky, and, in the case of budget and more compact lenses, may take the place of the manual focus ring as we discussed earlier. If you want to use EF or EFS lenses, many of which are still great and can be very cheap for what they offer by the way, you will need an EF to RF adapter, one version of which has a control ring. Whether a control ring is useful or not is a matter of personal preference and ergonomics, but for the more budget cameras with fewer manual controls, it can offer an extra way to quickly adjust your settings, the exact available options of which are listed in the manual. Personally, I find the hold meter button variants awkward, but if your lens's control dial is in a location where it can be accidentally bumped easily, they may be useful. Those with camera bodies lacking a third multifunction button, such as the R7 and R10, might want to consider assigning the control dial to the ISO function, as even if you use auto ISO, it's easier to manually adjust in a pinch than using the default button or touchscreen. If you're in stills mode, it also allows you to change from auto temporarily while activating metering, which by default is done by half pressing the shutter button and focusing. To do so, make sure Speed from Metering, ISO Auto, is set to Restore Auto after metering, and while metering is active, change ISO with the dial it's assigned to. The word Auto will be grayed out, and your selected ISO will be locked for the duration set in metering timer. Your options for video modes vary widely from camera to camera, and may be organized differently from what you see here. So I'd advise consulting your manual or a model-specific guide to learn more about what exactly you have available. General things to look out for are what your camera's maximum allowable resolutions and frame rates are, what compression options are available, and whether certain modes or resolutions have a mandatory crop. Some modes may be line skipped, which generally reduces image quality, while others could be a one-to-one sensor readout, which often involves a crop. Oversampled modes downscale from the entire sensor and usually give the best image quality for a given resolution. Information such as this may not be present in the manual, so you may want to check out third-party video-specific guides for your camera model. Rolling shutter is another important consideration when choosing a video mode, since the resolution, frame rate, and presence-absence of a mandatory crop can affect the degree to which this happens, even within a particular camera model. Generally, oversampled modes are more susceptible, and lower resolutions less so. This handy camera sensor readout speed chart lists the various video speeds for several popular models of Canon cameras, but even if yours is on here, I would advise testing out the modes for yourself to see where your own personal thresholds for rolling shutter lies, and in what situations. You can also reduce rolling shutter, or jello effects, by avoiding jerky movements, zooming slowly, and also panning smoothly if you're tracking a moving subject. Slow motion video of 120 frames per second or higher can be a source of frustration to activate, though some newer camera models like the R5 Mark II and perhaps the R50 V can select these frame rates as normal. Most other Canon cameras must activate high frame rate mode, which disables sound recording and auto-slows the footage into a 30 frame per second video. Unfortunately, this can't be set to a button or quick menu, so you have to dig around in the menus to access it. As an extra annoyance, disabling it does not return you to your last chosen video mode, so if we're using 4K for instance, you'll have an extra step to get back there. If your camera body has custom dials that can be assigned to video, I highly recommend dedicating one of these to high frame rate mode in case you need it quickly. Otherwise, an entry in the favorites menu will save you a bit of time. If you're a shooter of both photos and videos, you've probably tried to use the record button while in stills mode before, instead of switching or dialing to the dedicated video mode. On many Canon bodies, however, this emergency record mode offers only a very limited selection of options and controls, and even disallows subject tracking. So as tempting as it might be, I recommend instead getting into the habit of switching to full video mode and repurposing that record button for something else. I also recommend switching the shutter button to act as start-stop record, as it's ergonomically less awkward on most R series bodies. Unless you're on the R100, you can also just tap the record button on the LCD. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned at least a few new things. I certainly did in the course of making it, which took over a year. So if you like this video and want to see more such content, please give a like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.